World War II was the most destructive war ever fought. The devastation leveled entire cities throughout Europe and Asia. However, one major power exited the war almost entirely unscathed: the United States. The United States' position between two oceans left it far away from most of the fighting. However, this did not leave it out of the war. The United States spent a major portion of the war operating its Pacific Fleet and battling against the Japanese all across the ocean. Amidst the chaos of the Pacific theater of World War II, including major campaigns and battles such as that of the Philippines, Midway, and others, the lesser-known action in the north of the Pacific often goes unnoticed. In this video, we will be discussing the Aleutian Islands Campaign and the attempted Japanese invasion of Alaska. The Aleutian Islands are an archipelago lying off the coast of Alaska. Along with the rest of Alaska, the islands were purchased from Russia in the Alaska Purchase of 1867. Over 70 years later, these islands would be drawn into the largest war in history. By mid-1942, the Allies and the Japanese were engaged in a full-scale war in the Pacific theater. Following Japanese success in the invasion of the Philippines, the East Indies, Southeast Asia, and numerous islands in the Pacific, it appeared that the Japanese were winning the war. It was not until the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942 that a major Japanese operation was finally stopped. Despite this, the Japanese soon set their eyes on another target, seeking to draw out and destroy the American fleet once and for all at Midway. At the same time, however, the Japanese were also moving ships and men north to take part in another attack: the invasion of the Aleutian Islands. The primary motive for attacking the Aleutian Islands is somewhat disputed. It is possible that the Japanese saw strategic value in the islands. It is also possible that it may have been an attempted diversion as the Japanese Navy prepared for the upcoming Midway campaign. Either way, the Japanese sent ships, men, and aircraft to begin an offensive. From June 3rd to June 4th, the Japanese began bombing raids on Dutch Harbor, and in the coming days would begin taking the islands. On June 6th, the Japanese landed on Kiska Island, and on June 7th, they landed on the island of Attu. Many Americans grew concerned over the Japanese occupation of the islands, seeing them as a potential base of operations for raids on the west coast of Canada and the US. Additionally, American forces sought to liberate the islands as a matter of pride. However, the Allied forces would not undertake any major attempt to retake the islands until many months later. In the meantime, the Japanese were able to receive supplies and even civilian assistance in constructing fortifications and bases on the islands from Japan. It was not until the Battle of the Komandorski Islands that their position was seriously threatened. This battle allowed the United States Navy to blockade Japanese-held islands, forcing the Japanese to limit their supplies to only those which could be delivered using submarines, severely weakening their capabilities. Considering the circumstances, Allied troops decided to begin the campaign to retake the islands. The US began to bomb the Japanese garrison and territory on Attu for weeks, a bombing campaign designed to weaken the Japanese forces before the oncoming land attack. On May 11, 1943, US troops initiated Operation Landcrab, landing about 11,000 troops on Attu. US commanders expected the operation to last no more than a few days, but harsh weather and terrain caused it to actually take over 2 weeks. Knowing that they were outnumbered and that a land attack was imminent, the Japanese troops had withdrawn to high ground. This resulted in a waiting game, during which Allied troops died from gangrene, frostbite, and Japanese guerrilla tactics, while Japanese troops died from a lack of supplies due to their severed supply lines. At daybreak on May 29th, Japanese General Yasuo Yamasaki made one final frontal charge at the Allied line, catching them off guard and making it all the way to the American support troops before failing. The victory and recapture of Attu left only one island with a Japanese-controlled garrison, Kiska. American commanders, having learned from their mistakes on Attu, began amassing cold weather supplies and expected to face several times as many Japanese troops as were on Attu. On August 15, 1943, about 35,000 soldiers landed on Kiska. Allied forces engaged in sporadic firefights, with the thick fog making it extremely difficult to see the enemy troops. It was not until the island was completely liberated that the combined Allied force realized the Japanese had actually already withdrawn, and the 300 casualties they had suffered had been entirely from traps, mines, and friendly fire. On August 24, 1943, the Battle of the Aleutian Islands officially ended as the US declared Kiska secure. However, the American recapture of the islands had important ramifications later in the war. Japan was forced to reposition some of its troops in the Pacific to secure against a possible American invasion from the now US-controlled Alaskan Peninsula. This cost Japan forces in the South Pacific, forces that could have been used to prevent the United States' strategy of island hopping, taking over one island after another from Japan. Throughout the war, American planes continued to conduct bombing raids on Japan's Kuril Islands, with the goal of ensuring an attack from the Alaskan Peninsula remained a threat. While the military aspect of this story is important, it is equally important to discuss the civilian effects, particularly the fate of many native to the Aleutian Islands. 42 Alouettes were taken prisoner by Japan, 17 of whom did not survive, and in June and July of 1942, the US evacuated 881 Alouettes from several islands. They were then put on military transport ships and taken to abandoned canneries and mining camps in Alaska. Almost 100 Alouettes died from the horrific conditions of these camps. Moreover, the US military destroyed many of their homes to ensure the Japanese couldn't use them, and removed religious icons from their churches. The troops fighting in the Aleutian Islands during the campaign suffered brutal conditions, and ultimately, many of the inhabitants of the region did as well. In a war filled with battles and campaigns as large as D-Day, Stalingrad, Okinawa, and many other famous operations, it is often easy to glance over smaller events or dismiss them as unimportant. However, it is crucial that we do our best to remember not just the major battles, but also battles such as the Aleutian Islands Campaign, and examine and remember the mark they leave on history and on the people surrounding them.